Welcome to Computer History with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. The only thing you can expect from Computer History with Chris Garcia is the unexpected. And today, we're going to go slightly backwards to UK computers go commercial. And the United Kingdom was the site of many of the most important advances of computing through the 1950s. You had machines like the Manchester Mark I, the Manchester Baby, Colossus the Witch, the Pilot Ace, and they were all key advances in the state-of-the-art of computing. And in many ways, gave the UK the upper hand to the US, but it was an advantage that wouldn't last, at least not into the era where corporations were more interested in funding R&D in the US, and that led companies like UNIVAC and IBM to take a significant lead. Most of the British commercial machines made by the various British electronics companies were based on research machines at university designs or things done for the government. The first British commercial computer was the Leo, or Lyons Electronic Office, created by Lyons' chain of tea shops for doing everything from payroll to logistics. It was based on the EDSAC, and it was designed by Douglas Hartree and Morris Wilks, both of Cambridge. This machine was a major step forward, and it's usually called the first commercial computer. Again, there's some fudging there. Lyons leased time on the machine to various groups, both public and private. It was a business machine, and it was fairly successful if underpowered. In 1954, Lyons decided it was time for a Leo 2, and that started a specific company to design, build, and deliver them. That was Leo Computers Limited. Now, the Leo 2 was sold outside of the Lyons chain, and it was successful enough that they figured a follow-on was most important. And by that point, UNIVAC and IBM had been selling computers, and they had been selling outside of themselves the whole time. Though almost always one of the big computers that IBM would make would always be delivered to IBM for use designing the follow-on computers. In 1961, Lyons released the Leo 3, which was a solid-state transistorized computer. It was microprogrammed, and it supported highly complicated multitasking. The master program, more or less an operating system, was able to maintain 12 programs running in various states at any given time. These machines were sold throughout the 1960s, and some stayed in service through at least 1981, 18 years after Lyons Computers merged with English Electric. Now, English Electric had been in the game since 1955 with the release of the Deuce, which was an amped-up version of the Pilot Ace built by the National Physical Laboratory. English Electric had been in the game since 1955 with the release of the Deuce, which was an amped-up version of the Pilot Ace built by the National Physical Laboratory, which itself was a winnowed-down version of Alan Turing's Ace design. Now, the Deuce had 33 delivered, including the first commercial machine sent to Australia. They withdrew it in 1964. Now, partly that was because it was based on vacuum tubes used in magnetic drum and mercury delay lines, all of which had been greatly outpaced by that point. Now, English Electric created several process control computers, but it was the 1961 release of the English Electric KDF-8 that was the really important general computer that they released. It was based on transistors and used core memory. It was basically a knockoff of the IBM 501, though they did license it. They created several machines in this line with a range of speeds and target audiences. In 1965, the most important year in computing up to that point, by my reckoning, they announced the English Electric System 4, which was based on the RCA's Spectra 70, which itself had been a variant of the IBM 360. Now, this was English Electric's last series. They would merge with General Electric Company in 1968, which brought them under the same umbrella as another major early UK computer company, Elliott Brothers. Elliott started doing the whole computer thing in 1950 with the 152. They did a number of small systems, almost all for military use, and a couple of them being analog computers. In 1957, they changed their name to Elliott Automation and released the 801, but it was really only a test platform. The 802 saw 6 made, and it was a legitimate machine, but it was the 803 that made Elliott a player, and that came out in 1959. They co-branded when they sold it commercially as the NCR Elliott 803. Now, a bunch of UK universities purchased the 803. It was much cheaper than making your own at that point, and it had an established base of programs for it that could be used. Because at this point, remember, people are still selling software. Now, the Elliott 503 was released in 63. It was a software compatible with the 803, but it was also much faster, 70 times faster, in fact. They sold about 30 of them. Now, coming out of the Manchester scene like Factory Records was Ferranti. Well, not exactly, but their computers began by productizing the Manchester Mark I with the completely unironically named Ferranti Mark I, which actually did see 9 delivered. They followed that up with the Pegasus, which was a much bigger deal, as there were far more installations. By 1956, or released in 1956, they sold about 38. Pretty good for a vacuum tube machine, in an era when it was pretty obvious that transistor machines were going to be hitting it big pretty quick. Now, they released a number of machines, none selling a bunch, but in 1959, they introduced the Orion, which was a novel move as it didn't use vacuum tubes or transistors, but magnetic amplifiers. Now, these are kind of like core memory, but they used for processing. Needless to say, they were a bit fuzzy, and the cost of transistors was climbing down incredibly quickly, which made it kind of useless. Reliability was also up, which was a big problem with early transistors. The Orion had numerous cool features, such as built-in time-sharing capabilities. And the one that's most interesting to me was that this was prior to decimal currency, and it could support the old shilling, crowns, tuppence, all that sort of thing. In 1961, they released what most people would consider a mini-computer, the Sirius, which was fairly successful. But by far, the most important advance for Ferranti was the Atlas. Now, the Atlas started life as Tom Kilburn's Muse. It was a design from the University of Manchester. Now, the Atlas was absolutely a full-blown supercomputer, and it was meant to compete technologically with the UNIVAC Lark and, of course, Stretch. The machine was fast, it was really reliable for the time, and it had one thing that would influence everything, and that was the Atlas Supervisor, an operating system. And the late, great Gordon Bell had this to say about the Atlas. In architecture, the Manchester Atlas was exemplary, not because it was a large machine that we would build, but because it illustrated a number of good design principles. Atlas was multi-programmed with a well-defined interface between the user and operating system, had a very large address space, and introduced the notion of extra codes to extend the functionality of its instruction set. Quite. Also, I'd like to apologize to any of Gordon's heirs for that imitation, but it's how he sounds in my head. I miss him. The British computer scene was significantly disrupted with the flood of IBM machines in the early to mid-60s, and of course by DEC mini-computers later in the 60s. While there were many UK companies selling computers at that time, ICT being the most well-known, and that was formed from a merger of English Electric and what had been Tabulating Machine Company and Power Samus. And they were merged eventually with Ferranti's business computer section. There's a whole lot more British stuff that we'll get into in the late 60s. But one area where Britain really succeeded, far better than many, was in getting computers into the hands of individuals. And we're not talking personal computers here, but access time, as particularly time-sharing systems became available, more and more individuals got their hands on it. And part of that was things like Elliott and Ferranti making that a main focus for the computers, was to get access to a large number of people. And they also had an exceptional array of programming languages, often focusing on ALGOL, but there were a number of them. Next time, I'm not sure what we're going to do, but it'll definitely be in the 1960s. This might be the time I do the early experimental machines leading up to the PDP-1. Or it might not. Who knows? Thanks for listening to Computer History. I'm Chris Garcia.